Hello, and welcome to Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us. Today's lecture, Understanding Cognitive Biases. So today we're going to be talking about the informal fallacy's awkward cousin, the cognitive biases. And I don't know why it's the awkward cousin, I just think that's kind of funny to say. But today we're going to be talking about cognitive biases. So specifically, we're going to have a brief introduction of what the cognitive biases are. We're going to talk about 5 different cognitive biases, and then we're going to review and discuss a few more tools that we can use to combat them. So cognitive biases are systematic patterns of deviation from rationality and judgment, influencing how we perceive and interpret information. These biases often emerge from heuristics, mental shortcuts that simplify decision-making processes, or from emotional influences that shape our responses. As a result, cognitive biases can significantly distort our reasoning, leading to irrational decisions and flawed beliefs. So what's important to take from this rather formal definition of cognitive biases is that the cognitive biases arise from the way that we as animals function with the kind of brains that we have. We're conditioned by our environment and by our limbic system, I think, right? The limbic system, our emotional response system to react to certain stimuluses, certain situations in specific ways. And through conditioning, we carry that into the future. Sometimes, however, the way that we react to situations doesn't serve very well. And that might suggest that we have a cognitive bias of some kind on our hands. And so we have to actively work to undo that. I'm sure many of you have found yourself in similar situations where you had a way of adapting to a situation that worked in the past, but now it doesn't serve as well as it used to. And so it's a maladaptive practice, and you have to unlearn it so that you can proceed with the good life, which means it takes work. Life takes work. That's essentially what a cognitive bias is it's a sort of holdover or holding pattern that our brains get stuck into. And there's 5 specific cognitive biases that we can look at today. Do bear in mind, of course, that there are a lot of them. There's a lot of ways that we don't think well, so many, in fact, that we wouldn't ever have time to cover them all. So the first one I want to take a look at is the confirmation bias. So formal definition here, a confirmation bias is a pregnant it's always an adventure. A prevalent cognitive bias that manifests when individuals favor information that supports their existing beliefs or opinions while disregarding evidence that contradicts them. This inclination can significantly shape how people consume information, often leading to a one-sided understanding of complex issues. So, not too surprising here, what a confirmation bias is essentially whenever we try to confirm what it is we already believe, meaning we often seek out information that speaks to the belief that we already hold. We're naturally inclined to confirm our beliefs rather than challenge them. Why? I don't know. Probably because we feel a lot safer when we are confirmed in our beliefs rather than challenged. Because when we're challenged in our beliefs, that increases anxiety and fear. These aren't good feelings. In fact, these are the kind of feelings we associate with survival and panic and the fight, flight, and freeze response. And so we seek out those things that confirm our worldview. Of course, you can imagine how detrimental this can be, because effectively what this does is keeps us in the specific bubble that we already live in. So instead of going beyond our given world, we try to stay within it. And effectively, it just makes us closed-minded. And of course, depending on the kind of lifestyle you lead or would like to lead, this is going to impact the quality of your life. Fortunately, though, there are ways to challenge this. And so as I give these 5 cognitive biases, I'm going to give different possible solutions for each one particularly, but of course bear in mind that they can serve across the board, and I'll review them towards the end as well. So first, we can actually utilize a tool that we spoke about at length in this lecture series, and that is the Socratic method. So we talked about how the Socratic method really shines when it's used in dialogue or conversation with others, But it can also help us in our own persons if we are able to internalize our Socrates. So one way to fight confirmation bias is to internalize Socrates. So historically, we know now Socrates mainly pointed out, what he enjoyed the most is pointing out when people believed they knew something that they in fact did not. So really, Socrates' whole mission was undermining confirmation bias. So when I walk in and say, oh, I know something about X, and then Socrates, logically shows us that we actually don't know anything about X, and then we find ourselves in a very humble position. We can internalize that process, and by so doing, challenge our confirmation bias. So when we lean into a set of data or a viewpoint that really just kind of affirms what we already knew and believe, there's no growth happening there. And so what we have to do is kind of keep the Socratic annoyance alive within us to challenge us and get us to ask ourselves, well, I know I believe this, and I know that this information that I'm getting confirms that belief. Now let's try to challenge it in some way. And so being the good Socratic that you are, what you want to do is find counter arguments to the belief that you're confirming and sound it out. If it's true, it will hold up to scrutiny. This is the great thing about the truth, is the truth holds up to scrutiny. So challenge it. And you challenge it, of course, by finding conflicting viewpoints or opposite viewpoints if you can't. There's one of my favorite philosophers is Jean-Paul Sartre, and his favorite things to do, or one of the things he thought he was obliged to do as an intellectual, was to think against himself, or to think against yourself. And that's largely what we're trying to achieve here with the internal Socrates, is learning to combat and to think against ourselves, to make sure that we're thinking as optimally as possible. Finally, we can, of course, just check for credibility, check our confirmation bias for credibility. Is the thing that's confirming the belief that I hold, is it sound? Is it something that's worth taking seriously? The next cognitive bias I want to talk about is the availability bias. So formal definition here. The availability bias is a cognitive bias that occurs when individuals overestimate the importance of information that is readily accessible in their memory. This phenomenon illustrates how easily recalled experiences or events can disproportionately influence our perceptions and our decision-making processes. So we favor the information that's readily at hand. Often that comes in the form of memories. And so, for instance, let's just say this, let's say I'm speaking about myself actually, but we'll make it about you. Let's say that you're someone that grew up and you used to not be afraid of roller coasters. You were never afraid of heights. You weren't afraid of anything. And then one day you took a flight, which never used to be an issue, and there was some turbulence. And it was severe turbulence. The kind where if you weren't wearing your seatbelt, you probably had to go to the hospital because you would have hit your head on the top of the plane. It's crazy to say that out loud. But let's say that happens. And then afterwards, you develop this intense fear of flying. So every time you get close to a flight, or the flight's coming, or you have to even book a flight, you're shaking, you're shaking, you're scared, you avoid it. It's just a mess. What you're obviously going to do whenever the idea of taking a flight comes up to you is you're going to work off of what is available to you, which is your memories. And you're going to say to yourself, I can't take this flight to go see my family members or my friends because flying is dangerous. You want proof? Think about that time that you almost died on a plane. That's availability bias. And the availability of the information, of course, is the memory that you have, or yes, in this case, that I have. I was in a really bad flight once, and I was flying into the south, and there was a storm coming in, and there was severe turbulence, and it pushed the plane down. It was all kinds of fun. And they ended up actually grounding the plane, and they had to check it out afterwards. But as a matter of fact, we were totally safe. But nevertheless, this is going to shape my experience, right? So in fact, depending on the kind of person you are, you might be totally afraid of flying. You never may fly again. And just think about how that's going to impact the quality of your life. No more traveling, no more seeing distant relatives. And then you're also kind of constantly a challenge to your family members. Like, oh, you never came to my wedding, or you missed grandpa's funeral, whatever it might be, and this doesn't look good on you. But you have this belief, well, flying is dangerous. Well, what we have here is an instance of availability bias, and we're basing our evidence on an incredibly limited set of data, essentially one piece of data relative to all the data we have in the world about flying. And what we know, as a matter of fact, is that flying is it is the safest form of transportation. So we move into the challenge phase. We actually have to challenge this availability bias that we have. And how do we do that? Well, we look at the facts. And so we have to look at all the data. So yes, I was in severe turbulence. That was scary, not a good time. Was I actually in danger? Those are two different questions. I didn't feel good, but that doesn't mean I was unsafe. And so when you look at the data, you end up learning about planes, and this is what you have to do when you have a fear of this kind. Is you have to challenge your fear with the data, and you realize planes are meant to sustain far worse than even severe turbulence. And this is true. You can look up videos of manufacturers at Airbus and Boeing flexing the wings of airplanes, and they almost get the wings all the way parallel to the plane before they break. Like, these planes are really hard to take down. And you start looking at all that data. The other thing you can do is look at the hundreds of thousands of flights that happen every day, and the fact that nothing interesting happens every day for years and years and years, except for one thing or another will pop up, but statistically utterly insignificant. And so you challenge that memory with tons of information. Of course, being a human being, this isn't going to matter, because you're still going to get on the plane and you're still going to poop your pants, and that's okay. So you just kind of have to press through it and keep going, because intellectually, rationally, you're safe, and it's going to take several iterations of getting on that flight again for your body to catch up. It's called exposure therapy. It's horrible, but it works, and you are safe. So that's availability bias. The next one is anchoring bias, and this one is a lot of fun. So, formal definition: anchoring bias refers to the cognitive phenomenon where individuals rely too heavily on the first piece of information they encounter when making decisions. This initial information serves as a reference point, or anchor, which can disproportionately influence subsequent judgments, regardless of its relevance or accuracy. So this is a very strange phenomenon that happens for people like us that have the kind of brains that we have. And to put it more in layman's terms, essentially, when we're having a conversation about something that involves numbers, often the first number that we hear, we get stuck on it. This bias is very similar to another bias, which maybe you could call it the serial bias, where we tend to remember the first and the last number of a sequence of numbers, and we forget the middle. It's very similar to this. But essentially, whatever number we hear first, that's the one we land on. Well, the people that benefit from this are very aware of this bias and this tendency we have. So when it comes to salesmen, right, like think of the classic situation of a car salesman. They know that number anchoring works, to their advantage. And so they're going to throw a number out there first, and it's going to probably be astronomically high because they expect you to go down. But they've already planned that in their head, so they give you a number, and then when you counter, they actually get the number they wanted. So here's another one. When you're negotiating your salary, there's the classic advice is when you get to the negotiation table is the first person to put out a number loses. This is the thing. So whenever you're at the negotiation table, it's like, well, what do you want to make? You don't answer that question. You answer with the question, well, how much can you offer? You always put it on the other person, because the first person to anchor loses. They set the reference point. Either that, or if you're pressed to do it, what you want to do is essentially think of the number of the salary that you want and then add like 10, 15, 20%, whatever it is. I don't know. I'm not a job negotiating master, but you want to add a little bit because you're going to get knocked down. This is going to happen. So you anchor high. You anchor high so that you stick close to it. What usually doesn't happen is that you find yourself way out of line with that initial number. So just think about that as well. Like if you've ever been in a negotiation situation and they might actually offer a lower number of salary. Oh, we would like to pay you $50K. And you're like, well, this job's worth $70K. Why would they say that? Because they expect you to counter. And then they'll be like, oh, 63, sure, that's fine. That's still way below their budget, favoring them, right? And you think you're happy, they're happy, everyone's happy, allegedly, the end. But number anchoring, very, very serious and something that we encounter a lot. So we have to combat it. And this one's a little bit more on the nose. What we have to do is go after that initial number. So at the negotiating table, for instance, if the employer says, oh, the starting salary is $50,000. Why? Just ask the question, what is this based on? What is the evidence for that? Can you show me the numbers? Can you show me the data? Is it arbitrary? Is it relative to what you pay other people in the company? Or is it relative to what everyone's being paid in the profession, in the country, et cetera? And that's going to give you a lot of information about the company and the job position that you're pursuing. So if they say something, for instance, well, that's just what everyone makes here. This should seem a little suspicious to you because it could still be the case that everyone at the company is underpaid. That's not a good argument. That's not good data. That's not good evidence. So, proceed with caution. If they're able to present facts and figures regarding, average salary of people across the nation in that profession, well, all right, maybe we're getting somewhere. Now you have to ask yourself or convince them that you're not the average. You're above average, and here's why. And then you present your argument. But with anchoring bias in general, we have to go after that anchor. So whenever we have those first impressions, we need to take a pause and just look at it and check the facts there. So the next bias is hindsight bias. So hindsight bias is a cognitive phenomenon characterized by the inclination to believe that one could have predicted the outcome of an event after it occurred. This bias often manifests in the form of statements such as, I knew that would happen, or I could have told you that. Such assertions reflect a false sense of certainty regarding past events, despite the reality that outcomes are often unpredictable and influenced by numerous factors. So this idea can kind of be summed up in the phrase that we hear a lot, which is hindsight's 20/20. So when we look back on things, we know what we would have said. We know how we would have negotiated at the negotiation table. We know how, the conversation should have gone in politics, or how the soccer player should have played, whatever it might be. We know in hindsight, this is how it should have went. You can also imagine how hindsight bias can be a little bit challenging for you, or even detrimental to you. Because essentially, if you're committed to hindsight bias, you effectively believe that you're someone that knows way much more, not only about the past, but something about the future, namely about how the future unfolds. Because what you're doing is ignoring the fact that you didn't know how future events were unfolding at the time that they were unfolding. You determined, or you learned how those events unfolded, and then you're working retroactively. So what's really interesting about hindsight bias is what happens is, let me see if I can say this right. When you're thinking about the past, what you end up becoming is blind to the future. So your sense of hindsight ends up negatively impacting your foresight, and you overcredit your foresight. So you get this privileged look into the past because of the kind of brains that we have, and then you somehow contort that into thinking, well, you can do the same in the other direction of time, and suddenly you're clairvoyant when that's not the case. Very tricky. And again, this sort of, as a cognitive bias, I think it centers around the idea of when we see how past events unfold, we sort of anchor into that and say, well, it must be the case in the future. Or, for whatever reason, we overestimate our capacity to understand the past. I'm not really sure why we do this. There must be some benefit of some kind. Maybe not. I'm not sure. Maybe we're just, really bad at thinking. So how do we combat this? Well, just like the previous bias we talked about, hindsight bias, one reason it crops up is because of memory. Our memory is very unreliable. And there's, of course, tons of studies about this, that we oftentimes even fabricate memories. We just create memories in order to either understand situations or to confirm our own views. And so what you have to do, or one way to combat hindsight bias, is to actually track the events that you're, considering as it's unfolding. That way you're sitting in the present, you're sitting in the moment, you're staying with the trouble and watching it unfold, and you're writing down and tracking, your experience of not being able to predict it. Maybe it's sports, maybe it's an experiment, I don't know. Maybe it's your friend's catastrophic relationship. I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, track it so that when you go and, later you go look back and you're like, oh, I could see that it was going to happen like that. Well, actually, as a matter of fact, you couldn't, and you've got the data to prove that. So I'm always sort of an advocate of keeping a thought journal of some kind. I've actually had a friend make fun of me for this, and he told me that these lectures are somewhere between philosophy and critical thinking and a self-help seminar. I don't know. I think that, maybe originally philosophy and self-help or whatnot weren't really that different, but I'll actually just take it as a compliment. But write in your journal and track your thinking and track how well or how poorly you're thinking. And then finally, we're going to look at the sunk cost bias or sunk cost fallacy, as it's also known as. Like I said, the fallacies and biases, they're cousins. They're very, very similar. The sunk cost bias occurs when individuals continue to invest in a project, decision, or relationship based on previously invested resources, time, money, or effort, despite evidence suggesting that the endeavor is failing or no longer beneficial. This cognitive bias stems from an emotional attachment often to past investments, leading individuals to irrationally persist in their choices rather than evaluating the current value of their options or what's happening in the present. This is a really dangerous one, and I think this is probably one that we've all fallen prey to. Essentially is, yes, whenever we invest in something in whatever way, we do that, money, time, effort, love, hard work, we get attached to it and we don't want to let it go. And we'll say the thing like, it's too late now, or I've already invested so much in time into it, it's best if I stick through it, through the hardships. And this crops up, of course, in investments. Sometimes this happens in investments. You dump a bunch of money into Bitcoin, I don't know, and it's just a catastrophic situation, and you're like, I just have to ride the storm. I've already got, my entire 401k sunk into it, so I have to stay with it. I have to stick with it, and things will turn out good in the end. When, all the current data says, actually, this is a sinking ship and you should run. Again, in relationships, if you've ever been in a long-term relationship of, 2-3 years and things start to get really difficult, maybe you find that your partner isn't as, active or compassionate as they presented themselves to be, and is sort of a couch potato or is emotionally unavailable, and you think to yourself, well, we've already started talking about starting a family, we've started integrating our finances, we live together, so I kind of just have to stick this through. This is a sunk cost bias. The thing to keep in mind is that you're not thinking clearly when you find yourself doing that. You have to look at your present evidence and ask yourself, does the present evidence match up and support this belief that I have or this bias that I have that I should stick with it? So, I don't know, thinking of the toxic boyfriend or partner or whatever, maybe this person actually has a pretty long history of being toxic. And maybe you meet the parents and their dynamic is really weird. And you're like, wow, they were not set up for success. This is strange. I'm seeing a lot of that coming forward in our relationship. This data is not promising. It is not suggesting that things will get better, not without significant effort and time and resources, in which case you have to ask yourself, is it really worth it? Is it worth it in terms of the future resources that you're going to have to sink in this relationship in order for you to make it work? Because that's what is at stake here is, yes, you've spent a lot of resources, whatever, again, those resources might be in some project of some kind, but you also have to think about, given the facts at present, how much more are you going to sink into it in order to sustain it? If you can think like that, if you can kind of break out of the emotional drama and the emotional tornado that you find yourself in and look at that, that should be a sobering bit of information is, well, how much more am I going to lose? How much more am I willing to lose? So that can, of course, be kind of difficult. So I'm, thinking, just because it's titillating, is thinking about the relationship thing here is, well, how do you break out of that emotional attachment? This is sort of low-hanging fruit because so much of what makes a relationship rich, of course, is the emotional aspect. but that can also be blinding. And so blinding, in fact, that you actually aren't able to see the negative impact that your relationship is having on you. So we probably can think about this as in the third person, from the third person perspective. I'm sure we've all had a friend that was in a bad relationship, and like we could see that very clearly, like, wow, this person you're with, not a good person. And they could not see it. They were so blind to it, in fact, that they were like, let's go hear the church bells. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is so bad. Well, this could absolutely happen to us. So what can we do to avoid that? And, very practical advice here, of course, is to, seek counsel from a trusted friend and try to be humble and realize that they have your best interest in mind. If they're a good friend, if they're someone that loves you, they're probably not being vindictive or selfish. They have your best interest in mind. And they're offering you a perspective of some kind that's worth taking seriously and adding to your data set as you're thinking through this. What seems to be true about humans is even if you tell them the right thing to do, they still have to come to that conclusion themselves, whether that's rationally or emotionally. So you might have to think and feel your way to the truth that your friend is giving you. But nevertheless, keep in mind that it's a data point and it's a step in the right direction. So rely on your community, rely on your friends, trusted friends, people that you look up to and respect. Yeah, so that's 5 of the biases. There's tons of them, but that's 5 of them. So what I want to do next is just briefly review the various practical ways that we can combat these cognitive biases and then speak a little bit more about a few other ones. So like I said, the solutions that I offered you can use them. They're not restricted to each and every bias that we talked about. And you can use them on the other ones as well. So the first way of combating cognitive biases in general, thinking about internalizing that Socrates. And Socrates essentially is your internal contrarian. He's the one that says, well, are you sure about that? Even to the point of being annoying. Socrates should be a kind of thorn in your side, the slight fever that you can't ever get rid of, that's constantly putting your beliefs into question. So really internalizing the Socratic method and using it as your warning sign to proceed with skepticism, charity, but skepticism. Another way of putting that in more contemporary terms, as the philosopher Sartre said, is to think against yourself. You've got a belief of some kind, and that's great. You're further along than many people, but now think against it. See if you can undermine yourself. And then, of course, always check for credibility. The other thing to do, we discussed, is look for alternative data. So when we were speaking about the emotional experience and the fear that I had on the plane, what I had to do to help myself overcome my fear of flying was to look at the facts, which means that I learned a lot about aviation. And that's just the kind of brain that I have, and and that's what I had to do. So learn about the thing, expose yourself to the sounds of planes. Why do planes make the sounds that they make? How many flights are there per day out of SeaTac, whatever it is. Just expose yourself to the facts and see if it supports your very idiosyncratic experience. The next thing we talked about, of course, which is kind of, again, on the nose, is anchoring number bias. And just challenging the initial, any time someone is trying to set a precedent of some kind, even if it's a definition, a number, a definition, a precedent, make sure that you agree on the basis. This is just good critical thinking. Something that we've talked a lot about here is looking at the premises. What is being assumed? What are the assumptions being made on which the conversation is proceeding? Look at those anchors and question the anchors themselves. Why are we making those assumptions? Are they sound? What are they based on? Are they okay to proceed from? Or do they themselves need further argumentation and proofing in order to be accepted? The next thing we talked about is our memory, very fallacious, very undependable. The best way to combat that, our faulty memory, is to track it as it's unfolding. Again, that might mean keeping a journal, keeping a personal journal. This is something I'm a big advocate of, and I don't know if I've mentioned before, I've been keeping a journal since I was 14, writing almost every day. I have over 40 journals filled with my boring life that, will plague somebody in the future, that good for them. But get in the habit of tracking your memories as they unfold so that you eliminate hindsight bias. Of course, something to keep in mind as well is the more that you track your days, the more that you write them down as they unfold. So at the end of the day, I don't encourage you to write literally all day as you're living. This would be very weird. But the more you practice writing that and sitting in the present, the more that's easier for you in the future. You stick more within the present. You stick more within your unfolding judgments as they happen, rather than trying to change them through hindsight. Of course, too, if you have a written record, you can always just fact check yourself. Well, I don't know if I thought that way, or I can't remember if X, Y, or Z happened, but I have it on record. And then finally, always relying on our emotional, intellectual support, our peers, the people that we look up to, our role models, our intellectual role models, whoever these people are, whoever it is you trust. If it's a religious figure, whatever it is, go to those people for advice, to check yourself as a sounding board. Even if you think you're right, if you have the right kind of friends, they'll provide you the space to think against yourself and challenge you and guide you in the right ways that you need as you progress in your personal journey. There you go. That's about as self-help as I can get. So yeah, generally speaking though, tools for combating cognitive biases, reflecting on personal experiences, maintaining a journal of some kind, and engaging in structured discussions and debates, particularly in places and forums where critical thinking is prized, where it's put forward and emphasized. So, of course, in a university situation, in a conversation circle, maybe focused around reading a specific text, anywhere where critical thinking is first and foremost.
Alrighty, as always, I want to leave you with a few reflection questions. So my first question for you is, if you reflect on your own perception of reality, which cognitive bias do you think you commit the most? Next, think of a time when you were consuming media of some type recently. Do you recall any cognitive biases appearing in the content? Finally, how might you develop the ability to counteract your own cognitive biases?
So next time, we're going to spend a little bit more time actually looking at how to combat fallacies and biases, because it's so important. And the better that we get at it, the better quality of life we can lead and the better example we can set. Yes, thank you so much for attending. I appreciate it so much, and I'll see you next time.